How does someone spend nearly half a century waiting for a sentence that was supposed to happen in a matter of months? It's the kind of case that forces an entire community to question how a single night can spiral into generations of consequences. A quiet neighborhood, a sudden disappearance, and a trail of clues so unmistakable it should have sealed the ending immediately, yet somehow, it didn't. For 46 years, the truth sat frozen inside courtrooms, appeals, and legal delays, while the people closest to the case lived with a question that never stopped echoing. Because what happened that night wasn't just a crime, it was the beginning of one of the longest, strangest countdowns Florida had ever seen. It started as an ordinary night, the kind people forget because nothing ever happens. Merritt Island was quiet, the kind of calm that makes you believe the world is predictable. But somewhere in that stillness, a young Marine was drifting through the dark with no real sense of direction. Witnesses would later describe him as moving like someone searching for something he couldn't name, unsteady, dazed, and out of place. He wandered into a neighborhood he had no connection to, a place filled with sleeping families who trusted the silence around them. And while the streetlights hummed and most homes settled into their final hours of rest, he kept creeping deeper into that peaceful block. No one knew it then, but the moment he stepped into that neighborhood, the clock started ticking toward a morning no one would ever forget. By sunrise, the calm that covered the neighborhood the night before was gone. When Rebecca's parents walked into her room, the sight hit them like a punch: an empty bed, a lifted screen, and a window open to the chilly morning air. For a split second, they hoped there was some harmless explanation. But the silence in that room felt wrong, as if the entire house already knew something terrible had happened. Within minutes, officers filled the street, knocking on doors, checking yards, and trying to make sense of footprints pressed into the dirt beneath the window. Neighbors stood outside in disbelief, whispering, watching, realizing the safety they took for granted had cracked wide open. And just as panic spread through the block, one clue would push the investigation toward a nightmare no one was ready to face. Not far from the house, a deputy scanning the area caught sight of something drifting near the edge of the canal, something that instantly froze him in place. What he found confirmed the community's worst fear. The water told a story no one wanted to hear, and suddenly the investigation shifted from frantic searching to finding whoever was responsible. As officers worked the scene, neighbors began sharing what they'd seen during the early hours. A young man wandering the streets, unsteady, unfamiliar, moving like someone who didn't belong there. The descriptions lined up almost perfectly. Same age, same build, same stumbling gait, and just when detectives thought they were chasing shadows, one resident mentioned a visitor staying nearby, a Marine no one in the neighborhood recognized. That single detail changed everything. When detectives heard the neighbor mention a visiting Marine, the energy in the room shifted. The young man's description matched everything they'd been piecing together all morning. So they went straight to the house where he was staying. His relatives didn't think much of his early morning return: soaked clothes, heavy smell of alcohol, stumbling through the door like someone who'd spent the night making bad decisions. But investigators knew that look didn't come from a harmless bar crawl. There were no flooded ditches near the places he'd been drinking, only the canal where the search had ended. And the shoes he wore? Standard issue military footwear, identical to the footprints pressed into the dirt beneath the missing girl's window. Within hours, fingerprints lifted from the window frame confirmed what detectives already suspected: this wasn't coincidence. The trail was pointing directly at him, and the evidence was tightening fast. At first, he tried to dodge every question, mumbling that the night was a blur, acting like the holes in his memory were bigger than the evidence stacked against him. But detectives didn't need guesses. They had footprints, fingerprints, witnesses, and a timeline that backed him into a corner. And eventually, the pressure cracked him. Leaning forward in that interrogation room, he began telling a version of the night that chilled investigators to silence. That recording later became the centerpiece of the trial, a calm, matter-of-fact retelling that left jurors staring straight ahead, stunned. When court opened in early 1980, the prosecution laid everything out with brutal clarity. The prints, the shoes, the morning he came home drenched, the confession he couldn't take back. the defense had almost nothing to fight with. It didn't take the jury long to return a unanimous verdict. And with that, the judge delivered the sentence that was supposed to close the case for good. Most people imagine death row as a place measured in months, maybe a few years, but his became something entirely different. Once the sentence was handed down, the case slipped into a kind of legal freeze frame. Appeal after appeal, challenge after challenge, each one dragging the clock a little further. In 1989, he came within a single day of facing the sentence he'd been given, only for a last-minute ruling to pull him back into limbo. And that pattern kept repeating. Laws shifted, governors changed, entire generations grew up while he stayed in the same 6x9 cell, filing petitions that always ended the same way: denied. By the time the case finally crawled out of the courts, he wasn't the young Marine the community remembered. He was an old man staring down a decision that had been chasing him for nearly half a century. And Florida was finally ready to carry it out. When his final morning arrived, there was no tension, no outburst, none of the theatrics people imagine from death row. Guards said he moved like someone who had already made peace with the outcome. He didn't ask for a special meal, didn't request anything unusual, didn't try to send out any final message. He just sat in his cell, alone, waiting for a countdown that had taken most of his life to reach zero. And when the clock hit the hour, he walked into the chamber with his eyes closed, almost as if he'd rehearsed the moment 1,000 times during the years he spent staring at concrete walls. Asked if he had anything to say, he answered with a single word: no. Moments later, the sentence that had been stalled for 46 years was finally carried out. No spectacle, no crowd reaction, just a quiet ending to a story that had hung over the community for nearly half a century. With the sentence finally carried out, the long chapter of legal wrangling, uncertainty, and fear came to a close. Yet for the families, the neighbors, and anyone who followed the case, the wound doesn't simply vanish with a pronouncement. Decades of waiting, decades of imagining what could have been done differently, and a community forever changed. Those aren't things a verdict can erase. The question that lingers now is not about punishment or justice alone. It's about the weight of a single night and the way one person's choices can ripple through generations. After 46 years, the clock has stopped, but the echoes of that May morning in Florida will be felt long after the final pages close.